Hello, students. Thought I would record this screencast to share just a little bit of additional information about F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've chosen this picture for Fitzgerald because I think it gives us a pretty stark contrast between Sherwood Anderson and Willa Cather. Both Cather and Anderson are very much children of the 19th century, born in 1873 and 1876. And so they were 20 years or more than 20 years older than F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was born just before the dawn of the 20th century. Think about how different your perspective of the world is from somebody who is 20 years older than you. Or think about how much more you will know in 20 years than you know right now. So F. Scott Fitzgerald had a very different approach to life, you might say. And his clothing here sort of indicates that he is looking very dapper in this picture. And he was a kind of a celebrity. He lived it up quite a bit during what's come to be called the Roaring Twenties. He was a famous partier and drinker, and he actually more than likely drank himself into an early grave. He also did some pretty excellent writing. The first novel he published, This Side of Paradise, in 1920, really became kind of the calling card, the voice of this new generation. They were rejecting a lot of conservative ideas of their parents and of the nation at the time, and were really trying to find whatever kind of pleasure that they could in life. This Side of Paradise was a tremendous success. It launched Fitzgerald immediately into the limelight, and he became kind of a celebrity right away. And during his own life, he never replicated the success of that first novel, which is really interesting because the novel most of you have probably heard of, and that has been made into multiple successful movies, is The Great Gatsby. Published in 1925, this novel is some people's answer for the great American novel. And there's actually a really good chance that some of you had to read it in high school. And The Great Gatsby has come to be thought of as a very American story. A young man from fairly modest beginnings eventually becomes fabulously wealthy and lives the American dream, at least for a while. A lot of Fitzgerald's writing was fairly autobiographical. Obviously, he is not the Great Gatsby, but there are elements in that novel that mirror his own life. And a lot of the partying, a lot of the excess in that novel was representative of Fitzgerald's own life. He lived it up quite a bit during the 1920s. And one of the assigned readings for today, the short story Babylon Revisited, is published in 1931. And it is a older, more mature Fitzgerald looking back on the period of the Roaring Twenties. And I think you'll see in that story that Fitzgerald eventually regretted some of the things, some of his habits during those exciting times. A couple of other novels to mention. Two others, Tender is the Night in 1934, and then the last major piece of fiction we have from Fitzgerald is The Last Tycoon. Fitzgerald was working on this when he died, and so it was published posthumously. Now, I also wanted to share with you all a little bit of information about what kind of income Fitzgerald was earning from his stories. So online, there are copies of Fitzgerald's financial ledger. He did a very good job keeping records of exactly what he was making for stories and novels and movie rights. He was always a little bit worried about money. So the first thing that you'll read for today is a PDF on Moodle. It's a short story titled Babes in the Woods. Here it is mentioned in his ledger, published in 1919, and as you see, he was paid $30 for that story, which doesn't sound like much today, but remember this is 1919, before the Great Depression. more than 100 years ago, right? Now, the other story that I mentioned that you're reading is Babylon Revisited. So if we go to page 66 of the ledger, you'll see what he was earning for a short story in 1931. So 12 years later, take just a second and see if you can predict what he would make for a short story 12 years after Babes in the Woods. If you want to, you could even pause the screencast here and read both stories and decide for yourself, what do you think Babylon Revisited is worth? How much better is it than Babes in the Woods? But if you didn't pause, or if you're coming back and resuming the video, I'll go ahead and show you. So in 1930, Fitzgerald published Babylon Revisited, and he sold it for $4,000. His agent took 10% of that, and so he took home $3,600 for that story. It's a good story. And just so you know, we can do a historical currency conversion and see what $4,000 in 1930 is worth today. Again, maybe pause here, try to predict, try to guess what you think Fitzgerald would have earned in 2020 dollars for that story. You may be surprised to learn that he sold it for more than $64,000, which is pretty amazing. And that would buy pretty much any car you can think of, any reasonable car, and 2 or 3 of most model cars. What's even more surprising is that even though he was selling multiple stories for that amount of money, Fitzgerald was almost always living paycheck to paycheck. However much money was coming in, he was spending. He was living a lavish lifestyle, as I mentioned. Another complicating factor was that he was paying for a fair amount of care for Zelda Fitzgerald, his wife, and a kind of random piece of Asheville trivia. Zelda Fitzgerald actually died in Asheville. And so if you Google F. Scott Fitzgerald or Zelda Fitzgerald, you could learn the whole story. It's very sad, but you might be interested to know the details. That's all I have for you for this reading on Fitzgerald. Remember that there are no formal assignments on Moodle relating to Fitzgerald stories, but they are fair game for essay number 2, and you can always use them for, they are fair game for exam number 2, and you can always write about either one or both of these stories for your second essay.